Hello everyone. Thank you for viewing my virtual presentation. Today I'll be reviewing ongoing research on the use of star myths to transmit traditional ecological knowledge in forager cultures. This research was completed under the mentorship of Dr. Caryssa Dieni during my undergraduate coursework in the University of Oregon Anthropology Department. To begin, I will identify and define key terms that will be used throughout the presentation. In this presentation, the terms hunter-gatherers and foragers refer to peoples who are reliant on wild resources for all or the majority of their diet. An asterism is a prominent pattern or group of stars and will be used interchangeably with the term constellation. Our research also included references to individual stars such as Polaris, which will be referred to as asterisms as well. And star myths are traditional narratives that present supernatural explanations for the origins and/or features of asterisms. Research in ethnoastronomy indicates the use of asterisms by early agricultural societies to predict seasonal change and determine when to plant crops. Research also suggests that this knowledge was encoded in myth. We wanted to know how widespread these practices are among foragers. Specifically, how widespread are star narratives, and how widespread is the use of star myths to encode ecological information. Upon investigation, we found anecdotal evidence that foragers use asterisms for ecological purposes, such as predicting seasonal change and resource availability. For example, the Arawak and Warreo reportedly use the Southern Cross as an indication that it's time for the hunting of a local bird. We also found anecdotal evidence that foragers encode this information in star myths. In sand mythology, for example, the names given to stars usually represent animals that are abundantly available at the seasons that the stars are prominent. We also found anecdotal evidence that star myths encode descriptive information, such that asterisms can be identified by their associated lore. Among Inuit peoples, for example, star mythology maps the celestial sphere, and through the graphic narratives teaches the location of various stars and their relationship to each other. This is crucial when using stars in telling time or in navigation. Finally, we found anecdotal evidence that these myths are used as mnemonics. For example, one source emphasizes how stars could be remembered by the legends associated with them. The people before us had no writing system, so they had legends in order to remember. This evidence raises the question of how foragers use the stars to predict seasonal change. The presence and position of many asterisms varies across the year, meaning they may be visible for only part of the year, may rise and set at different times and/or places over the year, and may be higher or lower in the sky at different times of the year. Helical risings are a case in point. Helical rising is commonly used to mark seasonal change and refers to the first appearance of an asterism on the horizon before dawn after a period of disappearance. For example, Orion's appearance at dawn, its helical rising, in Arnhem Land signals the arrival of dingo pups. Based on this anecdotal evidence, we made predictions about the kinds of information we would expect star myths to contain. If star myths are indeed used by foragers to store and transmit ecological knowledge useful for subsistence, we would expect these myths to reference asterisms that can be used for ecological purposes, to provide information useful for identifying and locating these asterisms, to provide information about these asterisms that can be used to estimate time, to associate these asterisms with a given season or with seasonal change, to provide information about these asterisms that can be used for navigation, and to reference important seasonal plant and animal resources, or plants and animals that are cues of seasonal change. To test our predictions, we surveyed a cross-cultural sample of forager story collections for star myths. To generate the study sample, we used Murdoch's Ethnographic Atlas to make a list of forager cultures. Then, for each culture, we did a library search for collections of traditional stories. The atlas is organized into regions of closely related cultures. We found story collections for 82 different forager cultures distributed across 44 different culture regions. Next, we searched the story collections for stories about stars. We searched all story collections we found for each culture. We found 211 star narratives and coded all of them, including variants, for the presence of the predicted information. We coded each narrative for 6 different types of information, or content themes. Here, I have provided definitions of the first 2 content themes and examples of how they might appear in a traditional star myth. The first content theme, description, is any information useful for identifying an asterism, such as the number of stars in the constellation, their size, color, luminosity, path through the sky, their relationship to nearby stars and constellations, and the picture they form, such as a bear being chased by hunters. The example from the Sami describes the position of the North Star relative to the position and path of other stars in the sky, and also associates the stars with vivid images of animals such as moose and reindeer. The second content theme, time, refers to information about the relevant period of visibility, such as at sunrise or sunset, or about how to use the asterism to estimate time, for example, how long until sunrise. The example in the slide notes that the star, which is probably the planet Venus, appears just before sunrise, after the other stars have set or been obscured by the onset of dawn. Thus, when this star appears, you know that the sun will be rising soon. Note that this passage also identifies the star by name and contains information about how to identify it and locate it. It is the star that shines brightly, but only briefly. Also, it dances on the treetops, indicating that it appears rather low in the sky. The next two themes we coded for are seasonal change and navigation. Seasonal change includes any references to season, the season in which an asterism is visible, or the relevant season for using the asterism. This story example from the Neva clay gives two pieces of information about season. It notes that the Rheafoot constellation is visible in the summer, during the period when algaroba fruit is ripe. The navigation theme includes any information pertaining to the use of asterisms for spatial orientation, or to determine direction of travel. This is illustrated in the Nescapi passage, as it notes both that there is a star which can be used for navigation, and which star to use for this purpose, in this case, the North Star. The last two content types we coded for were animal and plant resources. The animal theme includes references to seasonal animal resources or animals that are cues of seasonal change, such as the geese in the Chumash example. This passage illustrates the use of animals as cues of impending seasonal change. When geese begin migrating north, that is a sign that spring is coming, and that many plant and animal resources will soon be available. The plant theme includes references to seasonal plant resources, or plants that are cues of seasonal change. In the passage from Northwest Australia, the Pleiades are associated with the onset of the rainy season, which signals that yams will soon be available. This story from the Wasco people of the Pacific Northwest contains 4 of the 6 content themes we coded for: description, time, season, and plants. The story tells us that this bunch of stars comes up in the evening, so we know the asterism consists of a cluster of several stars, and we know it comes into view immediately after sunset. However, the story notes that this only happens sometimes. The reference to spring in the next sentence suggests that this only happens at a certain time of year. Finally, the story tells us that this rising occurs when the bow and arrow woods are in bloom. This indicates that the arrival of spring is likely associated with this asterism, and that its arrival may signal the availability of a local plant resource. This slide shows the 44 different culture regions and 82 different cultures represented in the study sample. As you can see, the sample is geographically biased. 32 of the 44 culture regions and 64 of the 82 cultures are from North America. This is largely because the Ethnographic Atlas contains many more forager cultures from North America than from other geographic regions. Since we wanted to know how widespread star myths are across forager cultures, we didn't attempt to balance the sample geographically. This slide shows how the study sample culture regions are distributed geographically. Despite the North American bias, the regions in the study sample are linguistically diverse and represent a wide range of habitats. This chart shows the frequency of the 6 different content themes across all 44 forager culture regions in blue and across all 82 forager cultures in our sample, indicated with the orange bars. Descriptive information and references to animals were the most common content themes, being present in most regions and cultures. References to plant resources were much less frequent than references to animals. Information about time and season was fairly common, occurring in roughly half of the culture regions. Interestingly, references to the use of stars for navigation were relatively uncommon. It's important to note here that when we coded the myths, we only noted whether each content theme was present, not how many times it was referenced. For example, we didn't tally up how many different animal species were referenced in a given story, but we are hoping to investigate this in the next phase of the study. These results indicate that star myths consistently provide information that facilitates the identification of targeted asterisms. In other words, constellations are often described to the extent that they can be located in the sky. Further, results indicate that asterisms are regularly associated with the time of day or night, seasonal change, animal resources, and, to a lesser degree, plant resources. Also of significance is their tendency not to reference navigation. However, the information that asterisms can be used to predict seasonal change and/or resource availability tends to be implicit. Thus, for each region, we checked the ethnographic record to ascertain whether asterisms were indeed used for these purposes. This Australian star tale, for example, describes the constellation known as Pleiades, or the Seven Sisters, who are said to urinate and make it cold. Though the narrative does not explicitly state that the asterism signals winter, the ethnographic record can confirm the asterism's use for this purpose. This table shows the regions in the study sample for which we found ethnographic evidence of ecological star use. We found evidence for 22 of the 44 regions in the study sample. For the remaining 22 regions, we didn't find any claims that the stars weren't used for ecological purposes. We simply didn't find any information about ethnoastronomy, which made it impossible to draw any conclusions one way or the other. We analyzed by region instead of culture because in some cases we couldn't find any ethnoastronomical research for a culture in the study sample, but we found research for neighboring cultures in the same region. As you can see, the most frequent use was prediction of seasonal change, which was present in 19 or 43% of the 44 regions in the sample. The use of stars for time reckoning was less frequent, appearing in 8 or 18% of regions. Navigation was the least frequent use, appearing in 5 or 11% of regions. This table compares our findings for the story record and the ethnographic record. As you can see, the frequency of references to the use of stars for navigation was the same in each case, 11%. The frequency of references to the prediction of seasonal change was comparable for each record, with 55% of regions containing stories with references to this usage and 43% of regions exhibiting ethnographic evidence of this usage. However, there was a big discrepancy when it came to the use of stars for time reckoning, with 55% of regions containing stories with references to this usage, but only 18% of regions exhibiting ethnographic evidence of this usage. Our findings suggest that, like early farmers, foragers use the stars for subsistence purposes and encode their ethnoastronomical knowledge in myth. Since for most of their evolution humans have lived by hunting and gathering, the use of stars as an ecological calendar may be a very ancient practice. Our findings also support claims by indigenous informants that storytelling is an important means of transmitting traditional ecological knowledge. This suggests that storytelling might have been one of the earliest forms of teaching in human evolution. In our future research, we plan to continue our search of the ethnographic record for more information about how the stars are used in forager cultures, so we can do a more fine-grained analysis. At this time, we were only able to analyze the ethnographic record by region, but we would like to be able to analyze by culture as we did with story content. This would enable us to see whether there is a one-to-one match between the uses referenced in a given story and the uses reported in the ethnographic record. We also want to know more about the animals and plants referenced in the stories. Specifically, we want to know whether they were important in and of themselves for food, clothing, or trade, or whether they were used as cues to the availability of other resources. Finally, in the present study, we only coded for the presence of the predicted ecological information, but in the future, we would like to determine how much ecological information is encoded, on average, in a given story. Listed here are the ethnographic sources used throughout our research. Listed here, as well as on the next slide, are the story collections used throughout our research. Thank you for viewing my presentation.